You're entering Rock's World.
Welcome everyone to Rock's World. I am your host Rock, and I am happy to have you here with me. Before we get into the interview, it's Monday, of course. I just want to do a little housekeeping. Make sure you go to my website, rocksworld.com. That's ROCSWORLD.com. That way you can stay up to breast on all the different things I'm doing, speaking engagements, blogs, whatever. My social media, follow me on Instagram at The Rocks World. Make sure you like, share, subscribe to the podcast, sign up for the newsletter, all these crazy things that you can do to stay in touch with me, stay in touch with the content that I'm putting out, and be able to follow the guests that I am bringing on to speak with you. Anyway, we're going to get to the show. This week we are interviewing author James Russell Lingerfelt. He's written several books, one including The Mason Jar. He's a speaker, a blogger. He's lived a pretty interesting life, almost like a modern day Forrest Gump, in a good way. He's traveled all over the world. He's done a lot of different things, and so I'm very excited to bring him and his story to the show. We're going to talk about his life growing up in North Alabama, how he fell in love with literature, and how it, changed his world. Changed his world perspective. A lot of the humanitarian work that he did in Africa and the Middle East. Then we're going to get into things such as the relationship between grief, pain, love. We'll talk a little bit about his book, The Mason Jar, and then we'll sort of wrap everything up. Discussing, healing from pain, healing from hurt, and forgiving those who maybe caused that pain and hurt. So without further ado, here is James Russell Lingerfelt. All right, James, glad to have you on the show. How are you today?
Doing good.
So, you contacted me a couple of weeks ago, via Instagram, and in doing some research on you and your biography, I was there was just something very compelling about it, and looking at all the things that you've been involved in, you actually sort of reminded me of a sort of like a real life Forrest Gump, and I say that. With a lot of praise and a lot of affection. That's one of my favorite movies by one of my favorite actors. But I noticed some similarities with you being from Alabama, going to, very prestigious universities, traveling through the world, and just sort of having this holistic life experience. And it was very impressive to me. It was very inspiring to me, and I really wanted to have you on the show to sort of, bring me into your world, bring my audience into your world, because I think that through your travels and your actions, you've gained some. There's been some hard-earned, wisdom and insight, and so I want to welcome you to the show, and I want to start this off with from the beginning. I know you grew up in North Alabama, and I'm from Oakland, California, and
Nice.
I can think from me growing up about the farthest thing from Oakland, California in terms of lifestyle, demographics, whatever it might be, North Alabama. So
That's great, though. That's great. I love that diversity.
yeah. So I tell me about you were sort of, let's say, just dropped into the world in this corner of the world called North Alabama. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your childhood.
Well,
But I
I
haven't
tell you,
read a lot.
probably one of his most famous quotes is, and I can't quote it precisely, but he says something like, "You'll start at a place, and then you'll go on a journey, and then you'll come back, and you'll see that place for the first time."
Mm-hmm.
Like your home, you're at home, and then you go on a journey, and you come back, and kind of like what the screenwriter of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button said, who also wrote the screenplay for Forrest Gump, by the way. His name is Roth. Eric Roth, I think, is his first
Yes.
name. Last name is Roth. But he says, it looks different, it smells different, it feels different, but what you realize is you're the one that's different.
Right.
And so probably what people find interesting outside Alabama, because a lot of Alabamians don't realize how unique the rural area actually is. Like if you're in the rural area of Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and I would probably pull, Louisiana is its own culture. But if you look at the countrysides of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, if the people have never left, they don't realize what kind of unique life it really is. Because imagine, if you watch the movies or read the books, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn,
Yes.
just put the scenery in modern times. So the guy is going barefoot, the guy is swimming in the creek, the girl is trying to be cool like the guys, before they all go through puberty. The kind of tricks they play on each other, the kind of games they play on each other, like throwing corn cobs at each other. Just if you grow up like that, you don't think anything of it because that's just life. You play hide and seek in cornfields. But it's not until you leave and you experience other cultures and cities that you realize how unique growing up like that really is. I remember there was what we would call in today's time a farmer's market, but when I was a kid it was called Trade Day, and I'm 37 now, so we're talking, I would say, before 1995,
right.
when Walmart or Target built their first, because when Walmart came into town, that's when Trade Day ended, and they're reviving it now, but it's more out of nostalgia than anything. But you could get anything, and this is going to sound funny, and I'm saying it on purpose because I think the audience will get a kick out of this, but you could get anything from a wedding dress to a coon dog. The raccoon hunters.
Right.
I'm dead serious. Like, this really happened. You could go to Trade Day and you could pick out a pet rabbit, a coon dog, a chicken to either send it to the Gamecock fighters or to eat it. And I'm not kidding.
Right.
To wedding dresses, to a wedding ring, anything and everything you could possibly want, you could find it at Trade Day.
Right.
And it's all like secondhand stuff. So the wedding ring that you would buy at Trade Day is going to be 20% the price that what you would get at, Pruitt Jewelers. You know what I'm saying? Another thing that people find interesting is we did, swim in the creeks and rivers, but I grew up, probably the first 12 years of my life, I grew up on a dirt road on the edge of an abandoned cotton field that had turned into this beautiful prairie. Once the fields aren't being tilled for cotton, beans, and corn, they can turn into very beautiful just fields as far as you can see.
Sure.
And there was a pond at the edge of that field, and it was up on a hill, and it just overlooked this beautiful grandeur. And North Alabama is in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, so there's a lot of hills and there's a lot of waterfalls, and it's just I'm very, I kind of chuckle at some of the things that we did as kids, but I'm very also grateful because this was when we only had 4 channels on television. So we had 19, 31, 48, and 54. Those were the 4 channels.
Right.
Most people, if you had a satellite, you were considered wealthy. This is before cable. They probably had cable in the cities, but I know they didn't have it on the countryside, not yet.
Right.
Me and my brother, when he was 3 years older than me, and now he's a chemical engineer and he owns a construction company in Houston, so that's where he went. But when we were boys, we kept butcher knives our mother's butcher knives in knife sleeves on our hips in case we came upon a pack of wild dogs, and it was advised that we do that. Did we ever see a wild dog? No, but my dad and one of his friends, while they were out deer hunting, they came upon a pack of wild dogs, and they had to shoot at one of them to chase them off because they run right at them, and they knew they were there. What were the wild dogs going to do? I don't know. Now, these aren't jackals or coyotes. These are
like feral dogs.
Yeah, dogs that left home and went and turned wild. Like, this really does happen. So, like a house dog that decides to live on its own in the wild and then joins up with other dogs. Like, this really did. Like, people think I'm lying when I tell these stories, but this is stuff that happens away from heavy populated areas. And
I think I'm glad that you said that, because so many of us live whether within cities proper or in the close suburbs that that view of life, that sort of simple, and I don't mean that
I know.
derisively, but
No, no.
just sort of the basics. You have yourself, and you have your family, and you have your people, and the natural beauty of the land. That's something that most people, we don't have a frame frame of reference. It's something very romantic about that. And I that actually brings me to my next question is, in this environment, and you're growing up, and it sounds very compelling. It almost, I was wondering, how did you get into literature? But the way you describe your hometown and the surrounding areas, it actually seems to make a lot of sense that literature would be something that you were drawn to.
Yeah, well, I'll say this, and I appreciate that perspective, but I'll say it's a very romantic perspective, and I'll tell you why. In our culture of Alabama, they're only and I'm gonna say apart from the city, but it even the cities in Alabama are composed of people who grew up on the country and moved to the city. Nashville is a very southern city. Now it's changing because there's all kinds of reasons, but a lot of the taxes have been raised in other states, and so people are moving to Nashville for different reasons because of the music scene. The show Nashville really helped bring awareness, but people can make a living off the internet now, so they're going to cities that they want to be in. So Nashville's changing a lot, but I would say before 2007, it was a very country city. So it was just rural people moving to the city. Birmingham. Now, of course, you've got people that grew up, but on the weekends they would go to the countryside and get on their four wheelers, or they would go hunting, or they would, you know, Uncle Ted had a boat, and they would go to the lake and fish or just ride jet skis. But before we get into the literature portion, when I went down to Auburn University for college, I had people from Mobile and Birmingham listen to my stories, and they were astonished because they had grown up in the city. And yeah, they may have went to the countryside on the weekends, but it was irregular, and they didn't see that true Huckleberry Finn lifestyle of, wow, these guys, they were so country. They lived in such a rural area that they had to keep knives on them because of the dogs. In the city, it's like keep knives on you because of people, crazy people. But, it was just different. And, our property joined a state park. So nobody was really building anything on the property because it was protected by the state. So we had, hundreds of acres that we didn't own, but no one was ever going to build on it because the state owned it. So we were free to run wild in a good way. We weren't hurting anybody. We weren't hurting ourselves. But there was something, and this is going to sound funny coming from an Alabama boy, but one of my favorite books in college was Plato's Republic, because it really taught me how to look at things from two perspectives. Philosophy class taught us to take two opposing views and be objective about them. So I remember a paper that I wrote in college, and I got a C on it, and I worked really hard on it, and I told the professor, I was like, but I really believe in what I wrote. And he said, and my friend, everybody calls me Russell. And he goes, well, Russell, he said, I didn't grade you on how argumentative you were. I grade you on your ability to be objective on two opposing views. And that really, I'll never forget that. That was, 15 years ago. But it left a huge impact on me. I choose my reactions. Nobody can offend me or make me angry. I'm in control of how I respond. And so Plato's Republic, one of the things he said is the parents were debating, should we let our children watch the wars from distant hills? And you hear that a lot, parents asking, should we let our kids be exposed to violence, watch violence on TV? And Plato's argument was, when they're young, expose them to only purity, so that when they're princes and rulers and kings, they'll know evil when they encounter it. And I thought that was so incredible and brilliant. And the way that ties back into my childhood is, when you have public television channels, 19, 31, 48, and 54, the only time you're going to get nudity is if you get into your Uncle Johnny's Playboys. That was just a very realistic thing. Now, of course, you can access all that through your smartphone. So as boys, with that kind of sheltering, and my mom and dad, they weren't, naive people. They were very well versed. My mom grew up in Orlando, Florida. My dad, grew up in the rural Alabama, but he had a very good head on his shoulders, and he was a leader in his community and all that. So he was very sharp and wise in the Alabama culture. So it was expected of us to go to college. So I got it into Auburn, and the way I got involved in reading was when I was 17. I was really, I mean, I was an athlete in high school, so I was really big on fitness. So I got a subscription to Men's Health magazine. I actually hated reading before then, but it was because in school we were forced to read things that we didn't want to read. You know, we were forced to read Lord of the Flies. We were forced to read poetry by John Keats. And when you're in the 8th grade, who cares about John Keats poetry, you know? So, but when I started reading stuff that I loved, it changed. And so, you know, I was reading, you know, of course, when you're 17, you go straight to the sex articles. You go straight to the, oh, how can I get an 8, not a 6-pack abs, but 8-pack abs. I fell in love with reading that. But then when I got to college, I started being exposed to Thoreau and Emerson and Longfellow and C.S. Lewis and Plato and Henry Nouwen. And I'll start spitting some names a lot of people don't know, but it's because these are names that I started getting when I got deep into literature. But Henry Nouwen, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Jane Austen. I came to a place where I started enjoying reading literature from a woman's perspective, like Virginia Woolf, and what their perspective was on men and how women were treated before 1950.
And was that the draw, the perspective? I mean, what were you could spend your time on anything? Yeah, what were you getting out of it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was just interesting. I just found it. You know, my brother finds he'll read a piece of an introduction to rocket science. I'm not kidding. We just had this conversation last night. He's an engineer, and he just rips on the author for just being wrong. He's like, you know, this guy he's a mathematician. He thinks he knows rocket science, and he's explaining the fundamentals of rocket science, and he's just completely wrong about it. And, you know, when you dive into intellectualism and you start reading quality stuff, of course, when you're exposed to quality, you start picking out stuff that's not quality. And if you're passionate about it, you come across as an intellectual prude and snob, but you're just speaking from your experience.
Right.
And I remember being, as an undergrad, and just being frustrated with professors that came off as just jerks. But then when I got a graduate school degree and I was a professor in Nashville for a while, I started understanding it. Like, if you're saying something in front of 2,000 people and you're leading them wrongly, and you're going to say something, and then of course if they're not educated, you come across as an intellectual snob. You know, but you know, it's almost like a parent who listens to a teenage kid thinking that they know everything when the parent knows from experience that they're naive.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like that.
So, you know, with experience, now I know after you left Auburn, and some years after, you started to do a lot of humanitarian work, you know, in Uganda and Syria and in various places in the Middle East. What was which is, it's so funny because I'm looking at that, I'm like,
I know.
Wow,
Yeah.
I'm like, this guy is like this is a humanitarian. This is a great guy. I mean, so what was the draw for you, and what did you learn about people, as to sort of segue back to what you were saying, the professor or the adult who's lived in the world and had experiences, and they're speaking to adolescents, and the adolescents doesn't get, how did those experiences change you?
Well, I remember when I was 8 years old, we had a garden, and when I mean garden, I don't mean we had a long garden with corn, radishes, beans. And yeah, you know, we weren't poor, but we were probably, when I was 12, we were probably lower middle class. So we were between low class and middle class. This was like when the dad was going to the work and the mom stayed at home to raise the kids. And then when you become 12 and your older brother's 15, she gets a job as a teacher, which my mom did. And you move closer into town, you buy a bigger house with a bigger farm, and now you're living middle class or mid to upper level class. A 40-acre farm in New York, of course, is going to be astronomically expensive, but a 40-acre farm in Alabama is not. I think a 40-acre farm with a medium-sized house in Alabama might run you about 125 grand, whereas right now, I mean, 125 grand will buy you a nice-looking house in the city, and with a 1-acre lot. You know, so it's different in the rural area. But when I was 8, I was laying under. I was either 8 or 11, I can't remember, but I was laying under a shade tree on the countryside. We had just finished a full day's work in the garden. Basically, it was harvest, harvesting the beans and okra and all of that. And I just had this. I was looking up through the. If you've never done this, have you ever laid under a giant tree and just stared up through the limbs on like a sunny, nice day? Have you ever done that?
So,
Have you ever done? I'm asking. It's not a rhetorical question.
yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
one of the things about Oakland that people don't really understand is that, yes, there's the city, but the east side of Oakland is ringed by hills, and behind there's a ridge, and then you get into the valley where some of the other suburbs. But from that ridge until you get to the other suburbs, there are regional parks and redwood forests and different things like that. And all the schools that I went to was in that area. So yeah, I have walked through the forest
Yeah.
and sort of sat on logs and rocks and just looked through the redwoods and have the dappled light come through. And yeah, it's a magical feeling, and
It is. And it's something that people. I've actually talked to people in rural Alabama who've never done it. So I guess it may just be a certain part of our personalities that draw us to something like that. But anyways, it was one of my favorite things to do as a kid in the woods. And so I had this imagination of me with my best friend, and I believe that 17 was a full-grown man.
Mm-hmm.
And me and my best friend had on safari hats and backpacks, and we were in far distant countries that white people don't go to. And it's kind of like, it's a quote from Legends of the Fall where it says he was seen on a river that no white man had ever been down before.
Mm-hmm.
That's very like, if you have an adventurous spirit, you want to know what's out there. What do you mean? Why hasn't? Wow, you're really into the deep areas of East or West Africa. If you're at a place that no white man's ever been before, like you're in the Amazon, you're in the deep portions of the Amazon, like what's out there?
Mm-hmm.
And I was always curious about that. Like, what is out there? Like, what is on the other side of that field? What is on the other side of that edge? Like, I want to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I know people that don't. They're fine. I've got friends of mine. When they were in college, they said, I want to graduate. I want to get married, I want to have kids, and I want to be the coach of my dad's softball, of my kids' little league team.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what they wanted. They didn't want to go to Rome. They didn't want to go see, the archaeology of Egypt. If they never left their small town again, they'd be completely okay with that. I was the exact opposite. I wanted to see it. So
and it's funny. It's funny coming from an area like San Francisco and Oakland, which, for all intents and purposes, sort of has everything. But yeah, I had that same feeling. I wanted to leave. I want to just see.
I want to see it.
My favorite, one of my favorite memories growing up was when we would drive to Portland. I have family in Portland.
Oh, cool.
So driving through extreme northern California and Oregon, and Mount Shasta is my favorite mountain in the world. And just being out there. And it's like, yeah, what is on the other side of Mount Shasta? What's on the other side of that hill? I mean, it's a thing. It definitely is a thing.
Yeah. And so what happened was, in rural Alabama, everybody's Christian. Like, it's nominal. You're, and what I mean by nominal, and this is a term that's thrown around a lot in graduate school. Nominal means you're only Christian by name, and that would make a lot of people mad that are listening. But it really is true. Like, when you're filling out a form, what's your religion? Oh, I'm Christian.
Right.
You just check it. But your lifestyle is not really reflective of the character of the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's not reflective of that. And I know a lot of people like that, and I'm not bashing them. Like, to each his own, whatever.
People live in their experience.
Yeah, they are.
Right.
And so. So there was a church that was going to Jamaica, to inland Jamaica, where there's a 75% unemployment rate. And I was 19. We had taken some road trips, my family had, so I had been to California twice by then, and we had driven it. So I got to see a ton of the national parks. I'd been to Nebraska. The countryside of Idaho, Nebraska, and Montana is extremely underrated. It is so beautiful there. Mm. And we drove through it. We got to go, we drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, all of that, went through Texas on the way home, all this stuff. And so, but I'd never been out of the country. and I'd never been to New England. And the closest I've been to Manhattan twice, but I've never driven to New England and explored Maine and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. In New York State, which I want to. I was actually on a road trip to do that in 2012, and then a family member got sick and I had to come home. But and that's how I ended back in North Alabama. But when I went, anyways, it was my first international trip, and it's funny to say Jamaica, but we didn't go to Cancun, or that's Mexico, sorry, but we didn't go to, I don't even know the popular cities.
Like Negril and Kingston and
there's a port in Jamaica that's real famous. All tourists go to. But anyways, there was a church that was going on a medical relief, and I had a friend from Auburn that had invited me to go, and I just jumped on it. I was like, oh man, yeah, going to another country, I'd love to see what it's like. And I spent 2 weeks. How much time do we have together?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'm gonna go. I got there, and we stayed at a hotel, and we went into the hotel room. There was electricity was stable, but water wasn't. Like, you might have water that day, you might not, and it was hot.
Okay.
And there was on the bedspread, and this was like, we're staying in the nicest hotel, and there was semen on the bedspread. And when you're 19 from Alabama, and I grew up in a family that was very, my dad required us to tuck our shirt in before we left the house.
Right.
My mom made us wear a shirt to the dinner table, like we couldn't go shirtless. We weren't that redneck. Right. I'm making a joke. I don't care if you wear your shirt while you're eating or not. But it's just a mom, sat with their legs crossed, like it was very
proper.
We grew up on a dirt road, but it was a proper Southern family.
Sure.
So yes sir, no ma'am type stuff.
Right.
But I go to the hotel and there's semen on the bedspread, and and so I throw the bedspread off the bed, and fortunately the sheets were clean, and I walk into the kitchen, and the kitchen staff are barefooted, and it's not a cultural. Well, I guess it would be a cultural thing, but they did have shoes. Like, they weren't dirt poor, but they had shoes, but they were barefooted, and there was molded bread mashed into the floor. There were flies all over the food that they were preparing, and I remember being my 19-year-old sophisticated self looking at that and saying, I am not going to eat any of the food from this kitchen. Well, I'm not going to starve, so of course I ended up eating it. But by the end of the week, guess what I was doing? I was in there helping the kitchen staff cook the food for fun, because they were that laid back, and I was eating it, and I wasn't complaining. The food was fantastic. We were spending time with families that lived in shanties where the walls and the roofs were tin, scrap metal, and dirt floors, and had community outhouses. So you just go and it's not like concealed. Like, if you're going out there while you're using the bathroom, the people know who you are. They can see you. Right. Like, they can see your private parts, right? But they can see what you're doing.
Right.
And they were happy. And as a matter of fact, they were happier than most people that I knew back home. They had each other. They had community. They thought that it was enjoyable to sit on the porch and prepare the vegetables together,
So
and talk and eat. The wealthy could afford meat, and they would eat this really spicy jerk chicken, which was the best chicken I'd ever had in my life. They would go and climb. They would get coconuts and drill holes in them and stick straws in them and drink it, and that was a good drink. Like, we tried it. It was fantastic, and it was like a nickel in American currency. Like, it cost 5 cents. And can you imagine that? Like, drilling a hole in a coconut, sticking a straw in it, and it being, say, 3 cups full of, if you'd pour that into a measuring tool, it would have been 3 cups. That's a lot of liquid.
Well, yeah, they charge you $6 for that at the at the grocery store now.
It was 5 cents, and 5 cents.
So you're experiencing this, and what was that change like to look at that kitchen and say, I'm never eating?
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly what it was. It was like, Russell, half the stuff you own, you don't even need it. Like, you don't need that car. You don't need 15 shirts. You can do fine with 2. And they had the poor had built. They had saved up, and when you're poor and everybody else is poor, you work together on things. So everybody came together and helped you build your house. They gave you scrap metal. They gave you scrap tin, and this is how they had designed their house. They had built a house, and they had windows, but there were no window panes. They had doors, but there were no doors. They had doorways, but no doors, so that the breeze from the island could just constantly flow through the house and keep it cool. And it was 75 degrees year round, no humidity, little humidity.
Sure.
There was some humidity, but little humidity.
Right.
They had built a fence around the house and put a couple of guard dogs in the fence. And so when you approach, so you never made it to the house, you just made it to the gate. And the way you knock on the gate is you do this. You just clap your hands.
Right.
And that was door knocking. And the guard dogs was to protect. Now, within the fence were fruit trees that they had planted, and the fruit was bearing fruit year round. So they had the fruit from the trees that they could eat, and they had the fish from the sea that they could eat. And if they were ever wealthy enough to afford to kill a chicken and eat it, they did. And they dressed in rags because they couldn't afford the clothes. And the rags. I remember seeing a guy in an Alabama shirt because it had been probably a Goodwill shirt, right?
Right.
But I was like, they did not make an income. They might have a son that worked in Kingston and would send money home or something. But they did not have money. They just didn't have it. And they were fine. I would not want to live in that kind of condition, of course, but they were fine and they were happy. And it really turned me into a minimalist in a good way. And I don't mean like, you hear the word minimalist and it almost sounds like a bad term. But the idea is to live minimally. In other words, you look at 2 things and you say, hey, do I need this or do I want this? This thing that I'm about to buy, do I need it or do I want it? And I think when I was 19 going to Jamaica for a week, it made me, I was just like, wow, like I was having a good time. Like I was having a good time living with these people in these conditions, and which surprised me. When you come from a well-to-do world, you think that, oh, that would be miserable. But when you experienced it, it was actually, for me, it was taking away burdens. It was enlightening and all that. So what happened after that was, wait a second. When I came home, I was completely changed by the experience. And I thought to myself, if 1 week in an English-speaking country changed me to this degree, what would happen if I had spent 2 weeks there? What would happen if I spent a week in a country far, far away and they didn't even speak English? And then that's what propelled me into world travel, and that's the best way I can explain it.
Sure. No, that's beautiful, and it really sort of got me thinking about wants and needs. And I know that you've done a lot of work within marriage and family counseling. Some of the books that you've written really, I think, touch on this need for connection versus the things and the trappings, whether it's a maid or cars and fancy houses. And there was something that you wrote that when I read it, it reminded me of sort of how I've dealt with grief in my life, and the central, I guess, truth that I stumbled on that you wrote, and it was weird. It's almost like you took the words from my mind and wrote them down. And it was in your novel, The Mason Jar. And what you wrote, I want to just take this one line: grief and pain are proportional to our love.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Talk about that, and then talk about your book, The Mason Jar.
What's his name? I'm trying to remember his name. He's a 16th century writer, Shakespeare. One of the things that he had said in passing was 2 people who are the most bitterest enemies were 2 people who were once in love. Or he said it was something along those lines. When you have a couple that's divorced and they hate each other's guts,
Yes.
that shows you that in the exact same proportion, it's proportionate to the amount of love they had for each other at one time. I would say that the Mason jar is probably 85% autobiographical.
So do you find that when people are sort of in the throes of their grief, that they just don't recognize that, or do you think why do you think that people don't make that connection on their own? Why do you think people tend to get mired in their grief, and that grief turns into resentment, and that resentment turns into anger? What do you think the disconnect is?
Well, I think it's different for everybody. Um, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is social conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we really don't realize, you don't realize, I don't realize, and the people listening, you don't realize exactly how impactful your environment is. I don't realize it. I don't realize how impactful me being exposed to things is, especially social conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is a kid that grows up in a dirt road in Alabama will not see the world the same way as a kid that grows up in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to happen.
Right.
There can be peace and you can get along, which takes maturity, but you're not going to have the same worldview. Mm-hmm. You're just not. You have two completely different frames of references. We can unite on our love for the New York Jets. We can unite on our love for literature, mm-hmm. Trading baseball cards, a love for basketball. You played wing, I played low post, or I played point guard, and you played, whatever. You can find commonality with people, but you're never going to be the same. And then I find it really interesting how the reason why we're shocked, especially in the political climate we're living in right now, we're so shocked that someone would vote for this person instead of this person. Well, it's because we have this tendency to believe that everybody sees the world the way we do. Mm. I have this default belief. It's just, you have to catch yourself. But you have this default belief that everybody sees the world the way you do. And you just kind of have to remind yourself that that's just, and why? Well, it's because you operate from two frames of references. I hear people on both sides. I can't believe you voted for so-and-so, and the other person says, well, I can't believe you voted for so-and-so, and they end the friendship. That's immaturity to me. It's like, why don't you recognize that you come from a completely different frame of reference? But I think it takes empathy. I think it takes the strive to see things from other people's perspective, and I think that takes maturity. And not everybody would. I meet 70-year-old men and women who act more immature about that kind of stuff than 20-year-olds. So really, it's a journey. It's a matter of just the choosing to be empathy, but also kind of naturally born with it. Going back to the journey side, I've always cared about other people more than myself. It wasn't something that I adopted. I've been that way my entire life. Going back to your question, this is what I heard. Get over it. Well, that doesn't help. This is what I heard. Men don't cry. Well, that's not true. We have tear ducts for a reason. We have emotion for a reason. Don't let people see your weakness. Well, that's not true. Why are you afraid they're going to take advantage of you? Is that why you don't want them to see your weakness? That sounds like immaturity and insecurity to me. Now, as a grown man, I can say that. But when I was in my, when you're in your mid-20s, you think you're a grown man, and you are physically. But there's still a lot to learn. My God, like the stuff that I've learned since I was 30, I'm a completely different person now at 37 than I was when I was 25. In the context of what you were talking about. When we react, it's a combination of our frame of reference, where we came from, and what other people are saying to us around us. So it's going to be different. And I took a really, I went way out there to circle back. But it really is just going to depend on the person. Like, there's people that after a breakup, they commit suicide. Why? I don't know. But there were reasons. I had a girl one time, she'd gotten a divorce, and she was bawling, and she told me, now I'm damaged goods. That's what she said. And I'm sitting there thinking, and I'm like, what were you telling yourself about divorced people before you went through it? And what are you telling yourself about divorced people now that you've went through it? It was, both sides wasn't good. She didn't have a high opinion of divorced people. She probably had a very judgmental perspective on divorced people before she went through
Well,
it.
it's sold to us as a failure. I mean,
Yeah,
when I got divorced the first time, that was something that I wrestled with. What kind
yeah,
of man am I? What kind of father am I?
right. But
To
why? Well,
right.
here's the thing. Let's play some psychology. Why? And I'm being like a friend to you right now.
Hmm.
Why did you tell yourself those things?
Well, it was well, one, I know it was competition with my parents. My
Okay.
parents were divorced, and I felt that I deserved certain
Hmm.
things,
Hmm.
and so I wanted to provide that for my daughter.
Hmm.
So that felt like a failure. There is the way we talk about marriage, right? Because either you're single, you're married, and you're divorced. They are three sort of immutable states, right? Almost the same. Being a virgin, you're either a virgin or you're not a virgin, and so there's something sort of, once you enter that last stage, there is something within the lexicon or culture that feels spoiled, that feels that it feels like that you've been rejected. And if you're rejected and you've been discarded, what value do you have for other people? All of these things, and you don't really know where it comes from. I've thought about it. It is within the culture, but the programming is so deep and so fundamental. It's very difficult to see where your thoughts about yourself end and the thoughts that have been sort of incepted into you begin.
Yeah. Now, if you go back and dissect everything you said, it will fall into two categories: frame of reference or social conditioning. And so that's why I'm huge on diversity. I'm huge on diversity because diversity helps you realize what's a big deal and what isn't. Like, diversity would tell you, wait a second, why is quote unquote virginity even important? Why? Like, and I'm not trying to start a conversation on that. It's like, it's a rhetorical question. Think about that. Where, this idea that I am supposed to commit myself for the rest of my life to one person and only have sex with that one person for the rest of my life. Where does that come from? Like, that belief. Where? I mean, it's a rhetorical question. I don't want us to get into the weeds,
Yeah,
but
that would be hours
there's a
long. We could
book
write books
called,
on that, right?
yeah, on marriage, and on marriage, the go-to book that I found, and I have a degree in it.
Hmm.
I didn't even discover this until after college, but it's called Marriage: A History by Stephanie Kuntz. So for those of you who find marriage studies and marital counseling fascinating, go read that book. Oh my gosh, it's fantastic. It's published by Penguin Books. It's fantastic. But anyways, going back to diversity, uh, I can pull you aside because of my perspective and say, Rock, um, you didn't fail. The divorce does not mean that you failed, or that you're a failure.
Right.
Other people would look at you with a condescending view and say, my God, you failed. Well, if that's your family and that's all you know, you're going to feel it's natural. Well, of course you're going to feel like a failure, right? It's
Hmm.
because you don't have diversity. You're only exposed to this one group of people operating from this social perspective, from this frame of reference.
Sure.
But when you have diversity, you have people pulling you aside and saying, well, first of all, let's talk about the origins of marriage and how marriage has evolved since over the last 65,000 years.
Right.
And then you're going to start realizing through the conversation by this guy who studied this stuff on the other side of the country that you didn't fail at all.
Right.
But you're not going to figure out why until you have a lengthy conversation with him. Well, and that's why, they're really pushing for diversity on boards. I think that diversity, and this comes from a university background,
Hmm.
the way I chose my graduate schools was I looked at the professors and looked to see where all the professors graduate. In my department, where did all the professors graduate college from?
Hmm.
Because I wanted diversity. I didn't want
that
to be.
diversity of thought and experience,
I just want to go to a college where they all graduated from the same. Like if you look at some of the universities in Texas. I don't want to get specific because I don't want to get in trouble, but I know for a fact there's two universities that I'm thinking of where all of the professors in a particular department are from the other university. So the university let's say there's a particular university in Dallas and there's a particular university in Houston. If you look at the professors of a certain department in the university in Dallas, they all either graduated from that university or that same university in Houston, and then it was flip-flopped. I would never want to go to a school like that because they're just going to be it's going to be what they call intellectual inbreeding. So to answer your question, I know that I got a little bit of an artist in me, so I'll go off into left field and then circle back. But we tell ourselves stuff based on our frame of reference and social conditioning. So the more that you can get out there, and the more you can get educated in different areas, the more of an objective perspective you're going to be able to have on your own life when you self-examine.
Sure. In your writings and the way you speak and the way you move through the world, it feels very spiritual, almost as if you are on a spiritual quest. Yet, in almost none of your writings or even the way you speak, do you reference, any particular religion, sort of Christian, a nominal Christian, if you will. So if you can just, perhaps, very briefly touch on, the spiritual changes and awakenings that you've had as you've, met different people, gone to different parts of the world, and sort of expanded your sense of what is quote unquote normal.
Yeah. So go into any Eastern country and you will find so many similarities, but it's almost like an Alfred Hitchcock film. It's like an alternate reality. So that person, if you had grown up in the same town, you might have been best friends with that person. They like to fish. They like to watch basketball. Mm-hmm. They also have had a grandmother that had Alzheimer's and died. They want to be loved and respected and it be mutual. They want peace and they want happiness, but they have other ideas on how to attain it. They all want security, but they have different ideas on how to attain it. Mm. That coupled with them dressing differently, wearing their hair differently, eating differently, maybe tattoos is a rite of passage, or maybe it's a fashion statement, who knows. Those are the differences. And when you spend time with them and hear where they're coming from, judgment goes out the window. You're like, oh, well, if I was you, you know what? I probably would have made the same decision. But you don't figure that out until you spend time with them. And let me tell you something, Rock. I see this everywhere I go. Mm-hmm. When you hear people spitting hate, it comes from fear. Yeah. If you hear whites on blacks, blacks on whites, whites against Latinos, Latinos against blacks, when you hear people of a South American country bashing people from another South American country, when you hear Arabs against Jews and Jews against Arabs, if you spend time with them and you listen carefully, it all comes from fear. I don't know them, they scare me, and then that turns into I hate their guts. And so, like, when I'm sitting around, and you know how it is in the Old South, I mean, stereotypes exist for a reason. Right. You go south and you hear, hatred and racism. I'm like, you're scared of it. That guy that came by, and as soon as you were nice to him, and then when he walked by, you turned around and said, bye, 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 you were scared of him. Mm-hmm. And if you call him out on it, it just makes it worse. I'm not scared. Tell him to come out here and I'll beat his, Right. You know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, but why are you reacting that way? Because you are scared.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's, I don't know.
Let go of the fear. Like, here's the deal.
Yeah.
If you can let go of the fear, you can do anything you want. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, listen, if you're not hurting someone and you're not hurting yourself, and if you can just let go of the fear, and this, I told a family member this, and they said that I was wrong. And then a few days later, they came back and said, you know what, I was thinking about what you said, and that makes sense to me. And I told them, I said, if you aren't hurting yourself and you aren't hurting other people, you are free to do whatever you want. You want to go backpacking in Bhutan? Go. The only thing that's keeping you back is yourself and fear. Fear would be a part of, yourself. You're your own hesitation. And so I get a lot. How did you travel to these other countries? Why did you do that? Because I wanted to. And I wasn't scared. I mean, there were a couple of times I was in Mongolia, and there were a couple of times when I kind of got a sick feeling in my stomach, and I got out of the situation, and I'm glad I did looking back.
Right.
But I never let fear get in the way.
And how did all that sort of, sort of elevate you spiritually?
Compassion. Like, let's say, think of somebody. Let me think of something real quick. I mean, it's been a while since I just hated something, but let me think for a minute. All right, let's just think of someone in your past that if they had never been born, you'd have been okay with it. If I had pulled that person away from his audience and spent some one-on-one time with him and saw things from him perspective, I guarantee you I could have turned him into a friend. Mm-hmm. And it's not until you get out there and let go of the fear and get to know people, and then what happens is fear is replaced with compassion. And then if you look at the great writers of all time, especially the spiritual ones, they talk about how compassion is like the all-in goal. If you can come to a place where you're compassionate toward everyone, even the evil people or the people that you consider evil, if you can find a way to use a radar and find the good in them and dwell on that and try to pull that goodness out of them and affirm that in them so that they start, gravitating toward the good that you're affirming, and you can change their heart to good, that takes compassion, and that's like the ultimate level of maturity. So if you can come to a place where you're compassionate toward everybody, no matter who they are, it's like the highest level of maturity you can get to.
Sure.
And when I read stuff like that in grad school, it was like I knew that it was true, but I knew I wasn't there yet. And I'm not saying that I'm there now.
Right.
But
it's a process. It's a journey, right?
That's right.
I know we're actually starting to get a little short on time, and I want to give you the opportunity to, if people want to read more of your writings or follow some of the things that you're doing in your journey, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, just go to jamesrussell.org, James like St. James, and then Russell, RUSSELL.org. I'm on every single social network at JR Lingerfelt. JR Lingerfelt is my handle on most. Facebook, it's like Lingerfelt James Russell. But if you go to jamesrussell.org, you can actually click on all the icons. I haven't put this, I've got a Snapchat for JR Lingerfelt, but it's not on my website yet. But I am on there. Definitely on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and all that, Twitter. But The Mason Jar and Alabama Irish are two novels that are companion novels. You don't have to read one before the other, and they both follow the same characters. I'm writing the third novel right now, which is going to follow the same characters again, and it's going to wrap up the trilogy. I'm going to try to put out a novel every year, or at least every 2 years. So I also have a blog on my website at jamesrussell.org. It's on relationships, because my bachelor's degree is marriage and family counseling. The relationship blog has had 6 million views since 2012, so there's some good quality stuff. I don't always agree with this. I publish a lot of stuff that other people write with their permission, and I give them a link back. But there's a lot of stuff on there that I don't necessarily agree with, but I understood where they were coming from, and it was a good perspective, so I published it.
Sure.
So there's good stuff there.
Sure. So, with that, I think that's a great place to end it. And I just want to say I really appreciated, being able to sit with you, get to know you a little bit better. I've appreciated everything that I've read from you, and just your journey and your perspective. So, again, my heartfelt thanks.
Yeah, me too, man. It was good. It was real good. Thanks for working with me on it. I really enjoyed it. And you and I, I see you on Instagram a lot, so feel free to hit me up anytime.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon.
All right, talk to you later.